Welcome and bienvenue to the Paris Peace Forum 2021 and to this session called What Does Our Digital Future Look Like? Lessons from the Foresight Workshop. My name is Ronja Scheler. I'm a program director with Körber-Stiftung, one of the founding members of the Paris Peace Forum. What does our digital future look like? We don't know. What we do know, however, is that digital technologies and artificial intelligence in particular may herald the advent of a new time. They may disrupt so much of what we have seen or known before. And perhaps some of you know a quote from Stephen Hawking, who said, AI is likely to be the best or the worst invention that humanity has ever made. In order for it to become the best in the end, we need solid and good governance frameworks to harness and to regulate these vast changes that will come upon us. So governance has to improve. And here at the Paris Peace Forum, we're working towards a better global governance. Quite a lot of things have been going on in this respect with regards to digital governance over the last 2 days. There were many sessions, for instance, on how algorithmic governance can become more inclusive, how we can create international norms for better cybersecurity. Some big news in that respect was that the United States rejoined the Paris Call for Peace and Security in Cyberspace. And also, French President Emmanuel Macron had a meeting with international tech scholars on how future policies could look like. Similarly, how can future policies look like was the question that we tackled in our Foresight Workshop. We ran a workshop together with the School of International Futures on digital futures, co-designing AI governance, in order to come up with some innovative and some new ideas on how AI governance could be improved in the future. I will tell all of you a little bit about how the workshop went in a minute, but I do know that there are quite a lot of the participants that we convened in the audience here, and it was a collaborative collaborative effort, and this is the only time, the first time that participants are together in one room, and Thomas Paulsen, a member of the executive board of Körber-Stiftung, wanted to direct a few words to them. So please let's hear what he has to say.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. This is Thomas from the past, from Hamburg, from last Thursday to be precise. Unfortunately, I cannot be with you today, so I am recording these words a few days in advance. Unlike you, I could not see into the future and anticipate the outcome of your discussions. But I trust they were fruitful, and I hope you enjoyed the exchanges with such an excellent group of participants. We all know that technological change in general and developments in artificial intelligence, more particularly, have the potential to create huge benefits, but also huge risks for mankind. Our founder, Kurt Körber, addressed this tension during one of the Bergedorf roundtables in 1987. Until today, we have hosted nearly 180 of these roundtables, but this one in 1987 very fittingly took place at the Hôtel de la Paix, not in Paris, but in Geneva. So in 1987, Kurt Körber said, and I quote, "We know about the ambivalence of technology. On the one hand, the major problems of this world can only be solved with the help of science and technology. On the other hand, it is undeniable that cultural achievements are endangered in the process. Thus, technological advances place us in a tremendous tension between what they create anew and what they actually destroy." End of quote of Kurt Körber. Our aim with this Foresight Workshop was obviously not to destroy, but to create, to come up with some new ideas on the future governance of artificial intelligence. I look forward to learning about the results of your discussions, the artifacts that you create, and the policy options you came up with. Before I conclude, I would like to thank the facilitators who enabled you to look ahead, the teams at the Paris Peace Forum and Auditoire who helped us run the show, and my colleagues at Körber-Stiftung who were the masterminds behind this workshop. Above all, I want to thank you who embarked on this experiment together with us, who shared their thoughts so freely and who contributed in the spirit of the Paris Peace Forum to solutions for peace. Now please enjoy the final presentations.
So we're back here. Before we start our actual discussion, I want to welcome the 4 facilitators that we just saw on the stage, but who have now disappeared. I will introduce them once more. So hello, the 4 of you. We have Marcela Cepaya, a senior specialist on strategic futures with Natural England. We have Johan Skutte, a foresight specialist with the School of International Futures. John Sweeney, a transformative foresight lead, also with the School of International Futures. And April Ward, a policy consultant, also affiliated with the School of International Futures and a PhD candidate on the connection of peace and foresight. Before I will engage in a conversation with the 4 of them about how the workshop goes, I want to give you in the audience a bit of a flavor how the workshop was designed and what was behind it. So let me briefly introduce the workshop design that we should also be able to see on a slide. We brought together 60 brilliant minds from around the world for a multi-step foresight workshop. They were representatives of states, of international organizations, business, civil society, academia, and so on and so forth. And we put them together to work in very diverse groups. So group 1, yesterday morning, started working on 8 trends in artificial intelligence. They worked on themes such as critical infrastructures in AI, border management, environment justice, democracy, but also some horizontal issues like data privacy, cybersecurity, bias, north-south gaps, and also the geopolitical implications of technological change. Then Group 2 yesterday drew on these insights and designed 4 artifacts. Artifacts are objects that may emerge or may exist in the future. And we had 2 brilliant designers, Dominique Vassy and Laura Dudek, who put them in a 2-dimensional shape overnight. So they worked night shifts so that we were able to actually see these artifacts in the future. We gave them to a 3rd group of participants. We confronted them with them, and perhaps we irritated them with them. And they derived some policy options from these artifacts from the world in which these artifacts would exist. Policy options for now, for in a few years, but also for the slightly more distant future of 2040. Now, let's go back to the fantastic facilitators that we have with us. Our groups were only able to do all of this with the help of the 4 of you, so I'm very, very happy to have you with me on stage now. And we will start in a bit of a conversations about the different groups that you headed and the artifacts they came up with. And I would like to start the conversation with Team Blue. Team Blue was headed by Marcela, and there is an artifact that the group came up with, and we would like to see how this can look like. So there is an app called Global Citizen, and Marcela, would you be able to share a bit about what this artifact is about and what the world looks like in which the artifact does exist?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ronja. So our group artifact was an app from the future called Global Citizen that aims to give power to the people whose lives are being decided through AI. And it does this by mobilizing citizens to actively participate in defining the limits of AI through crowdsourcing. And users can view the data AI systems use for decision making, and it gives them the opportunity to amend their personal data to correct the shortfalls of artificial intelligence systems, and to do this in a participatory manner. And so the app does, however, come with an extensive terms and conditions, which you can see there at the bottom, that seeks to capture some of the implications of the 2040 context as identified by participants earlier in this process. And that includes key issues such as exacerbated inequality and lack of inclusivity, which was really a key focus point for participants throughout this whole process. Thank you, Ronja.
Thanks very much for this. Perhaps if we really think about how this world would look like, what were some takeaways on the policy options or the things that policymakers would have to do for such a world or in such a world?
A main takeaway or insight for me that came across, and this was consistent throughout the discussions, and especially in the policy recommendation discussion, was this call for accountability in the context of 2040, where AI is making decisions that impact human life so drastically. So what is the chain of accountability? Who are the main actors in this space? And how do we ensure there is not a disconnect between citizens and those accountable? And that very much drove a lot of the policy decisions that our group identified. And in addition, I guess a key takeaway was that really the power of the artifacts in bringing to life those futures. And it was really amazing to hear from participants, and now I quote, that the artifacts from the past and future are crucial in empowering citizens. They help bridge gaps. That to me sounds very much in line with the themes we have been exploring through this process and during the Paris Peace Forum.
Thank you so much for sharing this, Marcella, and also for highlighting some of the participant voices. That is a good reminder for me also to invite the participants who are in the virtual audience to submit your questions or your comments through the live chat function. I will make sure to integrate them here on the panel, and all the other people in the audience who are interested about the workshop, the process, the outcome, feel free to submit your questions anytime. I have a device here so I can see them instantly and make sure they are asked to the facilitators who are on stage. For now, let us shift to the second artifact. Second team was Team Green, headed by Johan Schutte. Johan, tell us a bit, what is the artifact that your group came up with? To me, it looks a bit like a smartwatch, but I believe it's a bit of a different thing. So can you share a bit about the world and the potential reality that this might exist in?
Yes, thank you, Ronja. So it's not a smartwatch, it is a bracelet. The idea originated from our discussion of the simulation of war games, and also which could become a spectator sport, and then also in terms of spectator sports, how people would use bracelets to gain access to these types of events, etc. And then also we connected that with border crossings and border security, and maybe using this sort of bracelet to actually cross borders that sort of is used instead of being a passport, or using a passport. But what happens in this artifact really is that the bracelet is officially adopted by the country of Artifiland to manage their border use. So there's some sort of government control, but also to keep tabs on their citizens elsewhere in the world, specifically also should they be in need, to rescue them, to know where they are. So it's sort of a global reach of that sort of government citizens network in a sense. And then also what is interesting is there's some sort of public use to this bracelet as well. And what happens are people, there's beads, and you can see that there's those colors, green, orange, red, and purple, which sort of indicates your trustworthiness. And people can allow or give trust to one another. And in that sense, when people see the bracelet, they can know whether you're trustworthy, even when you're traveling. So there's some sort of public exchange as well of information, and it's not just purely for government use. But what is shown in this specific visual, which you're seeing now, is guidance for officials, maybe at the border crossing, to help them understand and recognize which of these bracelets are fake and which are really the true ones. Because coincidentally, then there's also a black market bracelet which you can use to switch off and go off the grid. So it's in terms of these types of controls of citizens, and either protecting them or taking away some of their protection. And that is what the discussion was about.
Thank you so much. I mean, if we imagine a world in which such a bracelet existed and all of us would have it around their wrists, what did the group come up with? What would be needed in terms of policy or governance? Can you share maybe one or two insights on this as well?
I think in terms of the discussion, we moved away a little bit from the bracelet and looked at the world in which it really is embedded, and which translates very directly to our current realities. And one of the main takeaways from me and the discussions was the fact that the notion that tech can either be malevolent or benevolent. And the way this plays out very much depends on the agreement between governments and citizens, and the agreement that we will have with one another, but also academia and companies. And so in a sense, this points to sort of a new form of shared agreement, much like the agreement the first humans would have when they started cities, to know what a city is about and how we operate and how we function. And it denotes something of this, where we as governments and citizens and academia and companies, really whole of society, need some sort of new shared agreement of AI and the use of that and how that touches all aspects of our lives.
Thank you very much for highlighting this. It's really not only like a whole of government approach that we have been talking about in very many policy fields over the last year, but it's a whole of humanity approach in a way. And I think the Paris Peace Forum is also a very good expression of bringing together these different forms of actors and stakeholders in global governance. So thanks very much for these highlights. Let's move to the third artifact for now. We have two more to go, so please stay tuned in the audience. But the third was the one that Team Red came up with, a group that was headed by John Sweeney, or the group conversation was facilitated by John. But let's see what type of artifact they came up with. And John, perhaps could you share a bit about how this came about, what's a data potluck, and what world would this exist in?
Thanks so much, Rania. Well, the one thing about this artifact that I think is quite interesting is the way that it's quite different from the others. And of course, as you can see, and this is actually a hand-drawn artifact. Initially, the conversations emerged around data privacy, the question of trust more broadly, which is something we've heard. And then fundamentally, this question of what would the future and what would AI look like if we put communities at the center? And so the idea of a data potluck, of course, in the spirit of a traditional potluck where you, of course, bring your favorite dish and you also potentially even bring your own plate, is this: how would you show up and actually have data that could be available and shared and benefit the entire community? So you taste a little bit of everyone else's, you have the chance, of course, to sort of be enriched by what everyone else brings. And then, of course, you can see here as well, we also have the idea of saying grassroots at the door. So there's a trust component built into this. You can see also in this future, you're being asked to bring your own power source. And so there really was a sense that this was a radically different future, and that this was a space where we could think very differently about the kinds of things that AI needs to survive and thrive. And we know that data is at the heart of that. So really having communities who have ownership over their data and really having a strong sense of privacy, but also really having clarity around issues of informed consent and being able to understand who exactly owns the data sets, how do they participate in the processes of the supportive infrastructure needed to run AI systems, and being able to have that clarity at the community level was quite powerful. And as you can see also here specifically, it mentions that this is Medical History Month, so very sensitive data that typically, again, wouldn't be held or is subject to a variety of forms of regulation. And this was something I think that the group really wanted to dive into, and to be able to use the artifact as a portal to hold these larger questions.
could you perhaps also tell us a bit about the dynamics of how a group consumes this future artifact and what they take from this? So, I mean, you're confronted with the artifact. Our third group was, what happens in the Foresight Workshop when you present them with something like a data potluck in the future?
Yeah, so one of the benefits of artifacts as an approach is precisely that it doesn't just strike us in the head, but it really strikes us in the heart. And so the opportunity to engender not just a sort of a rational or analytical response, but to really create an emotional response, I think was the strength of all of the artifacts, and precisely was really at the heart of our design. And ultimately, I think that what this really challenged the participants in the third session was to think in different ways about the construction, the formation, but of course the implementation of policy options and approaches. I will say, however, that at first the group was actually questioning the plausibility of this particular future, and that's exactly showing us that the artifact is working. They were saying, well, this would only occur if there was this collapse, and this is a post-collapse. And then later they came to and said, well, wait a second, what if people really said, no, we want to own our data, and that turned into a global movement? And what would it look like if global governance, and certainly governance at different scales, was able to foster that? And so we shift to this sort of more transformational future, almost like a new enlightenment with regards to data and privacy. But that tension was quite palpable. And that's exactly the tension that we're after when we use approaches like artifacts. And really that tension is at the heart of Foresight, of really challenging our assumptions, enlivening and illuminating our biases, and really forcing us to call into question not only the perspective, but of course the privilege with which we view and make sense of the future. And so we were really excited to have a dynamic group across all of the sessions to be able to engage in these spaces.
Thank you so much for sharing these insights. I think it's an extremely rich example of how you can use some innovative methods that are not like panel discussions, but to force people to think creatively and to come up with some new ideas, I hope. We have a fourth artifact we want to share with the audience. Maybe we could also see this on screen. It is the outcome of Team Yellow's discussion. April Wood was the one facilitating their conversations, and perhaps April, tell us what this cartoon is all about. What type of artifact are we seeing here?
Yes, thanks so much. Very happy to. We had a fantastic group of participants, and this is really answering a question about deep fakes, perhaps interfering with an election. So the idea had been to create an application that gives you some sort of deep fake alert. Ding, ding, there's a deep fake that you're being exposed to, or listening to some sort of false information. And then the idea was that the 3D printing can print out a truth pill, and the phone has 3D printing capabilities built in. So you can select, do you want to be exposed to the truth, or do you not want to be exposed to the truth? Because it was brought up in the discussions that sometimes we'd rather not know if our family is not perhaps being as honest as possible. So we can opt in or opt out of that. So in this middle section, our character decides to take the truth pill, which gives a nice endorphin rush. And everyone is happy who has taken the truth pill, because being exposed to understanding what's real information is a joyful experience. And one key aspect to this is you can see on the bottom of Araphoria, this World Truth Council. So the idea is to create some sort of body that is really able to authenticate these, okay, this is a deep fake, this is not a deep fake. So we had a number of conversations around this World Truth Council and what that would entail.
Thank you very much, April. Maybe could you tell us a bit about the World Truth Council and perhaps also the discussions that this sparked in your group?
Yes, so as you mentioned, this process was with 3 different groups. So we had cohesive conversations, I would say, that centered on trustworthiness, but we definitely had in the final group a little bit of pushback and questions about, well, do we want a World Truth Council? How would we set it up? Who would the funders be? Would it be just one council, or would this be dependent on your geographic space? There was some questions about, okay, well, journalists would have to have the kind of protections in place to be able to find out if the World Truth Council is not undergoing any corruption, are they doing their jobs? So it really sparked a number of really interesting discussions about this artifact from the future.
Thanks, April. And perhaps also from your group, is there a bit of insights in what types of policy options or recommendations the group derived? Could you perhaps share one or two of these?
Yeah, so I think that there are a number of different pathways explored. I think that this concept of setting up some sort of almost like Wikipedia had been brought up as a potential model for establishing some sort of system for understanding what was real or not real online, especially as it had so many different implications for society, politics, the economy, et cetera. So I would say that this idea of really having a space where people could have easy access to some sort of application was definitely one key idea that came out of that, as well as the development of some sort of council that can really explore these issues of what false information is happening and being spread in the digital spaces.
Great, thank you so much. So it is really about creating platforms that can bring together different actors, different stakeholders, and so forth. So we hope to see this sometime in the future. Let's open the discussion perhaps to the five of us. And I was interested in some perhaps memorable moments or specific things that stood out in the conversations. And I know that all of you have facilitated a lot of these exercises before, but maybe there was something special about this one. Johan, could I start with you? Was there something that really stuck with you?
In terms of the process, what I really appreciated was it was just again an illustration of how Foresight helped us to make the familiar new and vice versa, and also how it challenges assumptions. And there were really two moments with two different groups where we actually saw the tables being turned on the conversation. So just to illustrate, the first one was originally we had a whole discussion about how AI is ubiquitous and that only the rich in the end can really afford to opt out of the system. So in essence, it's sort of they are allowed to, or they're able to afford vintage technology, or able to really switch off and go dark and not be part of the system, which is a bit different than now, because at this point, AI is still reaching our lives and expanding and connectivity in general. So that was a flip side of thinking about that. And the other way where the tables, the other moment which was interesting was at first when we thought about the bracelet was something that was really a symbol of citizenship and very closely connected to be a citizen and belonging to a specific country and a specific government. But we quickly realized that the opposite could be true as well, and where this bracelet could really be some sort of personal VPN to help you go dark and have you opt out, saying I am a citizen of this country, but at this point I'm allowed to switch off and I want to go dark, or I don't want to participate in the system at this point, which was very interesting discussion, moving from something that's validated and used by government to something that's sort of the opposite of that. And both of these in the end creates a rich discussion. So it sort of illustrated how Foresight can help broaden our understanding and really paint this broad canvas, challenging our assumptions and really help us to think about what we wouldn't have conversations about usually, or what would not be sensible or even seems logical necessarily, but just to help us make have that canvas to make robust policy decisions and discussions on. Thank you, Rania.
Yeah, that's great. I guess it also shows the ambivalence of the technological change, right? It could also flip either way, just like the discussions in your group did. So that's also a nice convergence of the two issues at stake, I guess. Perhaps, Marcella, do you have a moment that stuck with you or that you particularly liked about the discussions that you want to share?
For me, it really stuck with me that although each of the groups started with a very different provocation in the beginning of the process, and although we engaged with the different sets of participants at each step of this journey, the key overarching messages that came through were consistent across the groups. And that's the call for accountability in AI governance, which I already mentioned, but also the questions around trust in this future society and the need for human agency to recognize and mitigate potential perverse effects of AI in the future where possible through these participatory approaches. And although, we recognized that groups need to we recognize the needs of the future, the groups did question the plausibility of actually being able to meet that need in the future and challenge themselves to try and think beyond conventional methods and solutions through policy making. And it emerged, especially in our policy group, that there were clear ideas of policies that wouldn't be possible until that 2040 timeline and in that future. And we had a clear idea of what needed to be implemented in the extended present. But it was the middle of the timeline that really we had to work hard to delve into and really draw out what policies should happen in between to make that future happen. Thank you, Rania.
Let me perhaps take something that you said and move it over to John. Marcella said participants questioned the plausibility of some scenarios that were discussed in the group. Is it necessary that the scenarios are plausible in order to talk about policy measures that we can devise today to come to that future, or is that part of the creative tension that we need in foresight exercises?
It certainly is at the heart of foresight to lean into and play with plausibility as a metric or as a measure for thinking about the future. As Kat Tully, the founder and the executive director of the School of International Futures, said, in quoting Jim Dater, if we take seriously the idea that the world is a place of complexity and change, then any useful idea about the future should appear to be ridiculous. Which means, and actually this is something that a colleague, Wendy Schultz, says, that plausibility is maladaptive. Plausibility fundamentally as a lens to thinking about the future doesn't necessarily help us encompass the range of possibilities and even the seemingly preposterous potentialities that, of course, over the last year and a half, we've all been living through. But in our brains, of course, we have a neurological bias such that we want to lean and rely on memory. So, plausibility is something that scenarios need with regard to being able to show us the kind of logical steps that we might get to. But that works when you use scenarios. When you use artifacts, which are really meant to be a portal into a radically different world, then all of a sudden you're in a bit of a different space. So I think it's no surprise that some of the groups, and including the group that I was with in the last session, was kind of trying to understand and make sense of this question of plausibility. But again, I go back to this idea that actually that sort of response shows that the artifacts are working, that as a provocation, that they're fundamentally getting us to reconsider the kinds of assumptions that underlie our sense of plausibility. And I think specifically, if we look at certainly the last year and a half, of course, the tension of really this question of plausible for whom and plausible within what context really comes to bear on these conversations as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's move over to April. I mentioned already in the beginning that we brought together quite a diverse group of people, and I guess they weren't always of the same opinion in the rooms that you were facilitating. Can you perhaps also share a bit of the controversies that you encountered, or what are the issues that people disagree on, perhaps?
That's such a great question. It was interesting to be able to span that because I was working with these different groups that didn't necessarily know they were in discord with each other on certain points. So I would say one thing that stuck out to me was this fact of one group really wanting to go to depoliticize things in the way that Seatbelts are not particularly political. Air safety control isn't particularly political. So it made sense to that particular group to say, okay, well, solutions that we're having in the digital space and with regards to AI can or should be resolved in this non-political, depoliticized space. But then the next group came along and in many ways said, wait a minute, isn't that kind of, what I heard was, hey, isn't that the role of politics to deal with these, to be able to be trustworthy, to really handle these issues and citizen concerns well. So I think that really stood out to me as a clear discord between the different discussions we had.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent. Thank you very much. I think it's also part of the trade-off that we have between bringing together very diverse minds and then having them come up with joint conclusions. But I think we have really a breadth of things that we're still processing. And I also wanted to mention to the audience, we're still working on the outcome of the workshop, and there will be a report published, a digital website that can be accessible to as many people as possible. And we will also make sure to share about this with the audience here and with the broader Paris Peace Forum community. I have a few questions coming in from the chat, and I wanted to raise them to the four of you, and maybe one or the other feels qualified and willing to answer them. One is, and I like that one, were the participants in the group rather optimistic or rather pessimistic about the use of artificial intelligence and technologies in the future? What's your sense from the groups? And feel free to take a moment to reflect on this. This is not a quiz show, but maybe share some thoughts.
I can jump in, and perhaps I'll couch my response with one of my favorite quotes from the cybernetic theoretician Lewis Mumford, who said, "I'm a pessimist about probabilities. I'm an optimist about possibilities." I got the sense that a lot of folks were expecting the worst and thinking about, of course, misuse, and thinking about, of course, the implications that we've seen relative to ongoing conversations about the power of big tech, or, of course, government being in a reactive mode rather than an anticipatory mode. But there were moments, and a lot of these moments came at the end of discussions when we were sort of looking back of saying, you know, things can truly be otherwise, and there's always an alternative space. And I think that's where some of those conversations about putting communities at the forefront of seeing the opportunities for activist movements and for even broader coalitions, you know, with civil society organizations and governments to really be at the forefront of saying we need different models and we need different institutions to be able to support those models for efficient, impactful, ethical AI. And I thought that was something that was quite profound as the groups were moving through that journey, but it certainly was a journey to get there. And so I do think that we moved along the spectrum fully and completely. And also, of course, like any good journey, kept going back and forth along the way.
Thank you very much, John. Another question that I had coming in here is whether you thought there were different approaches or different concerns by people from the global north and from the global south. Do you think that is something that converges in the tech field, or did you see like a rift going through the groups that you were facilitating? Johan, what about your group? Did you sense some?
I think for us, it was not as much north versus south, but also due to the nature of our the bracelet, the questions it introduced were really the tension between different political systems. So it wasn't as much north to south, more about you know, different ways we organize ourselves as countries and political systems we use, and the conflict or the discrepancies or differences between those systems, which also then allows this technology to be used in many ways.
another, I think, a novelty or like a particular thing about this workshop was that it was designed as a process of co-creation. So as I was saying, we started with one group on the 12th morning, handed over to a second group on the 12th afternoon, and then a third group took over on this morning, in fact. April, could you share a bit how the handover between these groups worked? Like, how would they take over from one to the other, and what was the beauty of this, and perhaps also the challenges from this?
Thanks. I'm happy to talk about that. So in the different handovers, there was some space to kind of take a step back, look at the mural board that we had been using that had a bunch of sticky notes on it, to be able to get kind of I would say a quick bird's eye view of what was going on. But I think that was also the challenge, because getting a bird's eye view of a discussion that lasted over an hour is, I think, a really challenging thing to do. So just kind of pulling out a few key themes, some elements that were kind of running through the provocations, for example, or a few key elements that were running through the artifact. I think that it would have been, it's always fantastic to say, if I only had another hour, or if we only had, another XY amount of time, we could have gone deeper, explored more. But I thought that it was really effective and also interesting to say, kind of like that child's game when you begin a story and then you pass that story off, the next person says a sentence and the next person says a sentence. You get this kind of really interesting product at the end that you wouldn't necessarily have had if the same storyteller had started the story, continued, and finished the story. So yes, I thought it was a very interesting process to do it like this.
Great, thank you. Another question about the fact that we're still in the center of a pandemic, or hopefully no longer in the center, but towards the end of the pandemic, but we're all stuck with doing digital formats. And you as facilitators, I think, face particular challenges connected to this. Maybe Marcella or John, could the two of you perhaps share, what do you do to engage people and to bring people into interactions through the screens, and how can we do this?
All right, I'll kick us off. I mean, as it goes with online interactions, there are always some hiccups here and there. And, we deal with connection issues, but we have an amazing tech team in the background helping us to figure that out as we go on. As a team of facilitators, we do our best, to prepare in advance as much as we can with interactive tools that we can use with the group, and really bring the energy forth. And some of the activities that, they are tailored to doing it in the online format. So the way we did our implications analysis through the futures wheels, and really the artifact helps us to connect in this digital format, and bring the participants on board with what we've been discussing. And having the designers work with us on those artifacts really helped to enhance this digital format in this case, as we could create something tangible for participants to share amongst themselves and to discuss. And that was really helpful. So I'll send it to John now.
I'm afraid I cannot hear John. Can you?
You can hear me now. Okay. So I think from my perspective, aside from the classic, oh, sorry, you're on mute moments, which happen all the time, there are these opportunities to really create genuine trust and genuine safety, so that people feel as though, again, they're not just there representing an organization, but they're speaking critically to the insights and the kinds of implications that they see. And I think ultimately, as Marcella has noted, that the design and the experience of the process was really meant to draw out, of course, the richness of the expertise, but to also confront them with what is the big question, which of course is, how do we understand and make sense of the humans at the other end of all of these processes, whether we're thinking about, a particular provocation that has geopolitical implications, or AI as a product or a system as a service, or even these artifacts, right? That of course, some represent, very sort of, human interactions, but some imply human interactions. And so I think it was about trying to draw out that sense of humanity, and also, of course, to really tug on the heartstrings, if you will, of the participants as we were going along, so that they could be invested not just in an analytical sense, but really invested emotionally in taking these ideas on a journey together.
Thank you very much. You were mentioning the provocations that we were starting on, and I can briefly share also the themes that the first group started working on in the session 1. So we started working on border management issues. We started working on critical infrastructures. We started working on data standards. But then in the end, I felt that there were some common themes across all the issues. We were talking a lot about trust issues. We were talking a lot about citizens' involvement. We were talking a lot about multi-stakeholder approaches. And does any of you have a sense of why we were converging so much on these issues? Like, do people have the same concerns or all around the world? What was your gut feeling? Why did we end up in very similar spots in all the groups?
So I think that's it.
Yeah, April, please.
That's quite a challenging question. I think there are so many different ideas and people connecting from different spaces in the world. So you would perhaps expect not to see so many thematic convergence, but perhaps that just speaks to the way that digital technologies do have this global impact, do have not the same effects in different geographic areas, but they have there's some shared challenges, and since this technology is being experienced as perhaps relatively new technologies that are really having impacts on cultures as well, that could explain some of the convergence that we found. But you're right, it was very interesting to see that different groups spaced out came together with some similar ideas, not the same, but there was definitely a lot of similarity. I hope that answers more something.
It's an idea. It gives us an idea. I mean, we will have to work that out in the coming month and weeks and months. I'm sorry, but thank you very much for your thoughts on this. We have about 5 more minutes, and I have 2 more questions from the audience that I wanted to raise. There's a very general question about how the use of foresight methods can help us understand complex issues such as the future of tech, and maybe. John, would you want to share a few more like general thoughts on foresight issues, also for people who might not have participated in one of these?
Sure, Rania, thank you. I think that in general, foresight, of course, as we're seeing, and certainly in the last year and a half, we've seen further expansion of tools, approaches, and methods integrated into policy, planning, and strategy processes. But fundamentally, what we're seeing is that governments and organizations and institutions that really invest and bring foresight into their DNA, if you will, have not only a strategic advantage, but of course create the kinds of forward-looking cultures that really allow us to engage in a world where we're not just confronted with risk, things that we can, of course, assign a variability and a probability to, but also confront uncertainty. And uncertainty is really about engaging with things that are inherently, unpredictable, and really trying to confront, these black swans and these black elephants, as we say, the kinds of things that really force us to confront our sacred cows, and to really find a way to kind of hold a unique space of thought, such that as we move towards considering policy interventions, or we move towards refining strategic objectives, or we consider questions of implementation, that we're not just limited by what we know and limited by sort of conventional thinking. I think the other thing I would add to that, and I think our process has been a testament to this, is the value and the power of participatory approaches. How do we bring different voices? How do we bring different perspectives to bear? And of course, there's no perfect process. We can always enhance, who's in the room or who's able to be in the virtual space or how we choose to connect with others. But I think the spirit really driving our engagement and what excites me most about some of the more recent movements in the Futures and Foresight field is the opportunity to put participation at the forefront. Specifically so we can call into question the forces and the factors that are attempting to colonize the future. And so how do we move into a space to really allow a further democratization of foresight and futures thinking as not just a skill set, but as a mindset that can have value for everyone everywhere.
Great. Thank you very much also for emphasizing this point about collaboration. And I think that very much aligns with what I'm hearing and experiencing here at the Paris Peace Forum on site, and also the spirit that we experienced in the workshop. The last question that I have from the chat, I will take my right as moderator and answer it myself because it is a very broad one. It says, how will the workshop contribute to peace? And I think that is a question that I won't be able to answer in some very few words. But I want to say and end on this note on why did we do this and what's going to happen afterwards? I think it's become clear that this method or the different methods of foresight can initiate critical thinking, creative thinking about puzzles and about the complexity that we really are faced with in the world and in thinking about global governance. And creating more sustainable and more people-centered governance in various fields, but specifically in this field of emerging technology that will affect all of us so massively, is a contribution to a better governance of global commons, a better governance of the world, and essentially a more peaceful and more stable world. And this is the philosophy upon which the whole Paris Peace Forum is built. And it is my great pleasure that we could be part of this endeavor with our workshop. I want to thank the 4 facilitators who have guided our groups so ably and so brilliantly. And I want to thank the participants who might be in the audience with us. Thank you very much for being with us. We will be in touch. We will make sure to communicate our results. And I want to invite all of you to join the closing ceremony of the Paris Peace Forum at 4 o'clock Paris time. We will have footage from the end of COP26 with, amongst other speakers, John Kerry, who will give some live insights from the conversations there. I hope many of you tune in, and I hope to see you again at the next Paris Peace Forum in the future, in real life, hopefully. Thank you very much. Take care, and bye-bye.